What if the world was designed to push you out, to make you feel invisible, unwelcome, undeserving? What if you paid for something in full, followed every rule, walked in with confidence, only to be met with whispers, glances, and the quiet, calculated effort to erase you? Meet Amira Holloway, a black woman who worked harder than most to earn her place at the table, only to find that some people will do anything to pull the chair out from under her. But Amira isn't just anyone. She's Special Agent Holloway, FBI, Civil Rights Division, and while they may not see her coming, by the time they do, it's already too late. This is more than just one story. This is a series of real, raw, and unapologetic takedowns of those who think their wealth, privilege, or connections will protect them from the consequences of their own cruelty. This is about justice hitting harder than they ever saw coming. Would you have seen the signs? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stood by in silence like everyone else? Hit like and SUB if you love seeing karma in action. Comment your thoughts. What would you have done in Amira's shoes? And tell me, where are you watching from today? Amira Holloway stepped onto the plane with quiet confidence, her steps measured, her back straight. She had been in first class many times before, but she never quite got used to the weight of eyes that flickered toward her, scanning, assessing, and ultimately dismissing. It was a look she had encountered far too often, the kind that questioned her presence before she even had a chance to sit down. She adjusted the strap of her sleek black bag and found her seat, 3A, window side, perfect for a long flight. But as she moved toward it, something peculiar happened. People noticed her, she was sure of it, but no one reacted. A flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform walked down the aisle, balancing a tray of champagne. Amira opened her mouth to ask for a glass, but before she could, the woman angled her body away, presenting the tray instead to the man in 2A. "Would you like a drink before takeoff, sir?" she asked, her voice silky smooth. The man accepted, glancing at Amira briefly before shifting in a seat. She waited, expecting the attendant to turn toward her next, but the woman moved along as if she didn't even exist. Amira exhaled slowly, placing her bag beneath the seat in front of her. Maybe it was an oversight. Maybe she was reading into things too much. But as she settled in, the patterns continued. She reached for the small folded napkin on her tray table, only to realize there wasn't one. Strange. She pressed the call button above her head, waiting patiently. Nothing. The light flickered, signaling a request for assistance, but no one came. 5 minutes passed. She pressed the button again, this time keeping her gaze locked on the nearest attendant, a tall man with neatly combed blonde hair standing just a few rows ahead. He glanced in her direction for a split second before turning away, continuing his conversation with a middle-aged woman in designer sunglasses. Still, no one came. Amira's fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. The silence, the deliberate ignorance, it was worse than outright hostility. It was an erasure, a calculated decision to pretend she wasn't there at all. The man seated beside her, a broad-shouldered executive in a tailored gray suit, let out an exaggerated sigh. He barely turned his head, his voice laced with amusement. "You might be waiting a while," he murmured. "They only serve real passengers first." Amira turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. His smirk widened, his posture relaxed like a king on his throne. "Excuse me," she said, her voice level. He gave a nonchalant shrug. "It's nothing personal," he replied, flipping open a copy of the Wall Street Journal. "Just the way things work around here." The way things work. Amira had spent a lifetime navigating those words, unraveling their meaning in boardrooms, networking events, and social gatherings, where she was always the anomaly, the outsider. She thought she had grown immune to it, but something about this moment burned differently. She tried again. "Excuse me," she said firmly, this time directing her words toward the flight attendant passing by. The woman didn't stop, didn't even pause. Amira reached out, fingers lightly tapping the woman's sleeve. That finally got a reaction. The flight attendant flinched, taking a half step back as if Amira had grabbed her forcefully. Her brows knitted together in annoyance. "Ma'am, please don't touch me," she said sharply, eyes flickering toward the executive beside Amira, as if expecting him to back her up. Amira inhaled slowly, keeping her composure. "I've pressed the call button twice. I need a napkin." The attendant hesitated, looking as if she might say something else, then nodded stiffly. "I'll see what I can do," she said curtly before walking away. The executive beside her let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Now you've done it," he muttered under his breath. "They really won't serve you now." Amira didn't respond. She folded her hands in her lap, her nails pressing lightly into her palms, a subtle reminder to hold steady. 5 more minutes passed. No napkin, no acknowledgement. A couple across the aisle shared a whisper before glancing at her, then looking away quickly, as if catching sight of something unpleasant. A businessman 2 rows up, snapped his fingers, and instantly received service. The plane hummed softly as passengers settled in, but for Amira, the silence around her had turned into something worse: laughter. A sharp chuckle cut through the air, loud enough for her to notice. Across the aisle, Nate Coldwell leaned back in his seat, legs stretched out comfortably. His phone rested on his lap, the screen tilted just enough for Amira to see. A video played at full volume, some comedy sketch featuring a snobbish socialite mocking a newcomer at an elite gala. "Some people really think they belong here, huh?" The actress on the screen sneered, drawing exaggerated laughs from the studio audience. As if on cue, Nate smirked and laughed along, elbowing the man beside him. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Amira exhaled slowly. She knew exactly what this was: a performance, an orchestrated insult disguised as coincidence. The people around them weren't oblivious either. A few glanced up, registering the scene, but no one intervened. To her right, a woman in her 50s, diamond earrings, tailored blazer, the unmistakable air of old money, turned to her seatmate, speaking just loud enough to be overheard. "I expected better from this airline. Standards are slipping, don't you think?" Her companion, a man with graying temples, hummed in agreement. The meaning wasn't subtle. A few rows ahead, a younger woman, impeccably dressed in a sleek white dress, gave an amused little shake of her head and snapped a selfie, positioning her camera just enough to capture Amira in the frame. A caption appeared on her screen before she hit post. "First class is getting too accessible these days." A fresh wave of muffled snickers rippled through the cabin. Amira sat still, keeping her expression unreadable, but inside, a familiar anger stirred. This wasn't about her seat anymore. It wasn't even about race, not entirely. This was about power, control, and the pleasure some people took in making sure others knew their place. Another chuckle. Nate again. He tapped on his screen, playing another clip. This time, a viral prank video where someone gets escorted out of a 5-star restaurant for mistakenly sitting at a reserved table. "Excuse me, sir, but this isn't your seat," the waiter in the video sneered. "Oh, it's not? But I already ordered. Can I just stay?" The laughter track roared. Nate's smirk widened. Man, some people just never get the hint. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. Amira let the scene play out, taking in every expression, every whisper, every glance exchanged. They wanted her to react. They wanted her to break. Instead, she reached for her bag and slowly unzipped it. For the first time, Nate's smirk faltered slightly, his eyes flickering toward her hands. Anticipation flickered across his face. Was this it? Would she make a scene? Would she prove him right? But Amira simply pulled out a book. Hardcover, sleek, black gilded edges. The Art of Power. She flipped it open, angling her posture slightly so the gold lettering on the cover caught the light. She didn't need to say anything. The title alone spoke volumes. Nate's smirk twitched. He clicked off his phone, muttering something under his breath. The woman with the diamond earrings raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment further. The selfie girl frowned at her screen, refreshing her feed as if waiting for validation. The laughter didn't stop completely, but it thinned, weakened, because the moment they had been waiting for never arrived. The tension didn't fade. If anything, Amira's refusal to react only made them more determined. The laughter had died down, but the game had only just begun. Nate stretched lazily, yawning as he reached for a napkin. He unfolded it with deliberate slowness, eyes flicking toward Amira before swiping it across the armrest between them. His nose wrinkled in mock disgust. Damn, who sat here before? Feels like it needs a deep clean. The man beside him smirked. You never know these days. Nate hummed in agreement, rubbing the napkin vigorously along the leather before flicking it onto the floor. His movement was exaggerated, like he was wiping away something unworthy. Amira clenched her jaw, fingers tightening around the pages of her book. She wasn't going to react, but the humiliation burned. Across the aisle, a young man in his early 20s, phone in hand, lifted it discreetly and angled the camera toward her. At first, she thought it was another selfie, but then she heard the soft chime of a recording. "All right, guys, let's play a little game," he whispered, voice barely audible over the low hum of the plane. "Spot the one who doesn't belong." The girl next to him covered her mouth, stifling a giggle. Amira shifted, resisting the urge to turn toward them. She could feel the camera on her, capturing her discomfort, her silence, her powerlessness. Another notification sound. Someone was sending the video to others on the plane. A moment later, Nate's phone buzzed. He glanced down, grinning. "Oh damn, that's good." He turned the screen toward the man beside him, who let out a low chuckle. "Could have at least dressed the part," someone muttered. Amira's nails dug into her palm. She wanted to turn, to snatch the phone, to demand they stop, but she knew exactly what would happen. The moment she protested, she would become the problem. She inhaled deeply, staring at the words on the page before her, but they blurred together. She glanced up just in time to see the girl across the aisle lowering her phone. The movement was quick, practiced. Amira knew that picture had already been uploaded somewhere, captioned with something cruel. She could already imagine the comments. Her throat felt tight, but she refused to show it. Nate stretched again, turning his head toward her, amusement still dancing in his eyes. "Hey," he said, voice dripping with fake politeness. "You look kinda tense. First time flying first class?" His words were meant to provoke. He wanted a reaction, something to feed into the performance they were putting on around her. She swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth and shook her head. "Nah." He feigned surprise. "Could have fooled me." The laughter around her was softer now, more controlled, but no less vicious. It had moved past the blatant mocking stage into something more insidious, a game of slow suffocation, testing how much she could take before she cracked. She turned the page of her book, not really reading. Nate sighed dramatically. "Man, flights are boring. We should make things interesting." He pulled out a pack of cards, flipping through them before glancing at the guy across the aisle. "Wanna bet how long before she complains?" The other man smirked. 50 says she won't say a word. She's trying real hard to be classy. 70 says she snaps before takeoff. The laughter had settled into a steady undercurrent, low enough to sound unintentional, but persistent enough to keep Amira's presence under scrutiny. Nate tapped his cards against the tray table, eyes flickering between her and his friend as if waiting for something interesting to happen. His movements were slow, calculated, testing the boundaries of her patience. He stretched his legs lazily, the polished tips of his shoes pressing into the space in front of her. His knee nudged hers, not enough to be obvious, but just enough to encroach. She shifted slightly, reclaiming her space, but he only stretched further, forcing her to lean toward the window. His lips curled in satisfaction. Sabrina, his girlfriend, sighed dramatically and leaned against Nate's arm, her body spilling slightly into Amira's space. "Ugh, it's so cramped in here," she muttered. "I thought first class was supposed to be comfortable." She shot Amira a look, her message clear. Nate smirked and stretched his arm along the back of Sabrina's seat, his elbow dangerously close to brushing against Amira's shoulder. "Guess some people just take up more room than they should," he mused. Sabrina giggled. Amira clenched her jaw, willing herself to stay still, but the pressure against her side was unrelenting. Every inch she tried to reclaim was met with another casual invasion, a deliberate push toward the window, until she had nowhere left to go. The metal frame of the aircraft pressed against her ribs, a cold reminder that she was being boxed in, squeezed out of a space she had every right to occupy. The man behind her suddenly shifted, knees jamming into the back of her seat, the force just strong enough to make her jolt forward. She inhaled sharply, fingers gripping the edges of her book. The pressure disappeared for a second, then returned, a rhythmic, deliberate pulsing against her chair. He wasn't just stretching, he was shoving. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. He raised his eyebrows, feigning innocence. Problem? His voice was neutral, but the smirk playing at the corner of his mouth told her everything. He wanted her to react. She turned back around, pressing her lips together, determined not to give them what they wanted. A flight attendant walked by, and for a brief moment, she thought about saying something. But as soon as the woman passed, Nate let out a mock groan and rolled his shoulders. "Man, I need more room." Without warning, he shifted his position, knocking his elbow against her arm hard enough to make her flinch. The suddenness of it caught her off guard, her book slipping slightly from her grasp. Sabrina gasped theatrically. "Oh my God, babe, careful." Nate placed a hand over his chest in mock apology. "Oops. Reflex. Didn't realize I was sitting next to someone so fragile." Laughter rippled around them again. Amira swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay rigid. She reached down, adjusting her bag, trying to regain a semblance of control. But as she did, someone walking past suddenly slammed into her shoulder. Her body jerked forward, a sharp jolt running through her spine. She caught herself just in time, gripping the armrest, but her breath hitched. She turned her head, heart hammering. The man who had hit her barely spared her a glance. He lifted his hands in an exaggerated shrug. "Oh, my bad," he said flatly. "Didn't see you there." His eyes flickered with amusement before he continued walking. More chuckles. A few passengers exchanged glances, quiet grins passing between them. Amira sat frozen. Every part of her ached with the urge to push back, to demand space, to make them acknowledge what they were doing. But she knew the moment she did, she'd lose. She wasn't stupid. She had seen it happen before. The second she retaliated, she would be labeled angry, aggressive, the one disturbing the peace. Amira remained rigid, her body pressed against the cold metal of the aircraft's frame, her breathing slow and controlled. She knew the moment she let her frustration show, they would win. The pressure on her space hadn't let up, but the game was evolving, shifting from subtle to deliberate humiliation. The flight attendant appeared beside her, balancing a tray of condiments, as she leaned over Nate and Sabrina, their flirtatious laughter filling the cabin. The woman's elbow accidentally tilted just enough for a small plastic cup of ketchup to tip over, the bright red liquid spilling directly onto Amira's lap. The cold sensation seeped through the fabric, staining deep into the beige silk of her dress. The moment stretched, slow and unbearable, before the flight attendant gasped, hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry." Her voice was drenched in artificial concern, her eyes darting to the surrounding passengers as if expecting their sympathy. Sabrina let out a small laugh, covering her lips with perfectly manicured fingers. "Wow, that is unfortunate," she murmured, her gaze trailing down Amira's ruined dress. "But you know, red actually looks great on you." A chuckle came from somewhere behind her, low and amused. "Yeah, matches the situation perfectly," a man muttered. Amira clenched her jaw, her fingers twitching against the damp fabric. The flight attendant didn't make a move to clean it, simply standing there, the same polite but detached expression plastered across her face. "Would you like me to get you a towel?" Nate smirked, his eyes flickering between Amira's dress and her face. "Nah, let it dry. Adds character." The heat burned beneath her skin, spreading from her chest to the tips of her fingers. She could feel the weight of every gaze, some amused, some indifferent, none sympathetic. A few rows ahead, an older woman with silver-streaked hair delicately pulled a shawl tighter around herself, her nose wrinkling slightly. "I swear, the air in here feels thicker all of a sudden," she mused, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. A man seated across the aisle exhaled heavily and reached up, pressing the air vent above his head to full blast, the stream of cool air hissing between them. "Much better," he murmured, giving Nate a conspiratorial glance. Amira exhaled slowly, willing herself to keep her posture straight despite the burning in her stomach. The stain on her dress was impossible to ignore, the sticky wetness clinging to her skin, a physical reminder that she was being soiled, degraded, reduced to nothing but an object of mockery. The flight attendant finally moved, offering her a single, thin napkin, as if that would be enough to fix anything. "Here you go, dear," she said, her smile unwavering, her voice syrupy sweet. Amira took the napkin, her fingers tightening around the useless piece of cloth. The laughter was quieter now, but the damage had been done. She could feel it, the shift, the weight of invisibility morphing into spectacle. The laughter had faded into smirks and knowing glances, the kind of silent agreement shared among those who understood their place and those who didn't. The woman across the aisle, the one who had pulled her shawl tighter, adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist before leaning slightly toward Amira with a well-practiced, pitying smile. "Dear, I imagine this must be quite an experience for you," she said smoothly. "First class is a different world, isn't it?" Her voice was gentle, almost maternal, but laced with something condescending, something that said, "You don't belong here, and we both know it." A few seats away, a man in an expensive navy suit let out a thoughtful hum. "I've always admired determination," he mused. "You know, working your way up, saving every penny for an experience like this. It's commendable." He nodded toward her, as if offering approval for an effort he believed was doomed from the start. Sabrina tilted her head, her lips pursed in exaggerated curiosity. "That's actually really inspiring," she added, barely suppressing a smirk. "I mean, I respect anyone who takes risks, even when, they might be in over their head." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the nearby passengers. Amira swallowed hard, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her dress, her breath measured and controlled. She had endured passive dismissal. She had withstood the laughter. She had absorbed the deliberate dirtiness they tried to place on her. But now they were writing a story for her, crafting a narrative in which she wasn't just out of place. She was a spectacle, an unfortunate soul who had stumbled into a world too grand for her understanding. The flight attendant returned, her expression pleasant but unreadable, holding a laminated seating chart as if it were some sacred document. She stopped beside Amira's seat, tilting her head slightly. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" Her voice was light, innocent, as if she were genuinely concerned for Amira's well-being. Nate chuckled, shaking his head as he shuffled his deck of cards. "Man, this is getting painful to watch." Amira's jaw locked, her grip tightening on the useless napkin, the red stain mocking her. Every part of her wanted to snap, to demand they stop, to make them see her as more than this story they were building around her. But she knew how it would go. She had seen it before, heard it before. If she raised her voice, she would become the problem. If she fought back, she would become the aggressor in their carefully orchestrated scene. The woman with the diamond bracelet let out a small sigh, shaking her head with what looked like genuine regret. "I really do admire the confidence," she murmured. "Not everyone would have the courage to sit here knowing how things are." A man 2 rows ahead cleared his throat, glancing toward the flight attendant. "Excuse me, but if this is causing an issue, maybe it's best if the situation is resolved before takeoff." His tone was neutral, as if he were merely making a suggestion for efficiency. A soft chime sounded from the front of the cabin. Another flight attendant leaned into a quiet conversation with the lead steward, her gaze flickering toward Amira for only a second before she nodded. And then the words came, smooth and professional. "Ma'am, if you'd prefer a more comfortable arrangement, we can see if there's seating available elsewhere." The passengers around her remained silent, their eyes flickering between her and the crew, waiting for her next move, waiting for her to understand what was expected of her. She could feel their patience thinning, could hear the unspoken question in their silence. Why is she still here? Nate sighed, stretching his arms overhead as if this entire ordeal had exhausted him. "Man, this is getting awkward," he muttered, shaking his head in exaggerated pity. "I mean, come on, nobody likes feeling out of place." He turned toward the flight attendant, feigning concern. "Hey, I actually know someone in coach who would love this seat. Maybe we can, switch things around?" Make everyone comfortable? His voice dripped with false generosity. His smirk barely concealed beneath his feigned sincerity. A few chuckles rippled through the cabin, quiet but unmistakable. Sabrina leaned into Nate's shoulder, her voice light and airy. "That's actually so sweet of you," she murmured, loud enough for Amira to hear. Not everyone would go out of their way to help someone find their place. The flight attendant hesitated for only a moment before offering a polite smile. "We do have options available in our other cabins," she said, her voice careful, professional. "If you'd like to be in a more accommodating space." She placed a neatly folded pamphlet onto Amira's tray table, the glossy cover displaying an image of the economy section, bright and inviting beneath the bolded words, "Experience comfort at every level." Amira stared at it, her fingers twitching against her lap. The insult wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Across the aisle, the woman with the diamond bracelet let out a soft sigh, shaking her head as if this entire situation had been so unfortunate. "It's such a shame when people make things harder than they need to be," she murmured to no one in particular. The businessman a few rows up shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "We're already behind schedule," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Let's resolve this and move on." Nate exhaled dramatically, rubbing a hand down his face. "Seriously, at this point, it's just selfish." He turned toward Amira, his eyes locking onto hers with manufactured exasperation. "Nobody's forcing you to go. But maybe it's time to ask yourself if staying here is really worth it." Sabrina tilted her head, her smile sharp and saccharine. "I mean, wouldn't you feel more at home somewhere you actually fit?" The air in the cabin shifted, the pressure crushing, the weight of expectation suffocating. They weren't trying to remove her anymore. They were waiting for her to remove herself. Amira's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, a steady, aching drum of humiliation. Every part of her screamed for her to speak, to push back, to remind them that she had earned this seat just as much as they had. But she knew the moment she did, the moment her voice rose above theirs, she would become the angry black woman, the problem they had been waiting to confirm she was all along. The expectation was clear. She had been given an out, a polite invitation to remove herself before someone else did it for her. Nate watched her, fingers drumming against his tray table, his smirk widening with every second that passed. The passengers around them had stopped pretending to be indifferent. Now, they were waiting for the moment she would finally accept what they had all known from the start, that she didn't belong. Sabrina exhaled loudly, tapping Nate's arm as if exasperated by the inconvenience of her existence. "We're seriously still doing this?" she muttered. "It's not that hard. Just go." The businessman across the aisle checked his watch with deliberate impatience. The woman with the diamond bracelet shook her head, her expression pitying, as if Amira was embarrassing herself by holding on to something that was never hers. Amira let them believe it. She inhaled slowly, fingers reaching toward the pamphlet, but instead of picking it up, she slid it aside. The movement was smooth, deliberate, controlled. Without breaking eye contact with Nate, she reached for the zipper of her bag, her nails clicking lightly against the metal pole. The sound was small, insignificant, but in the charged stillness of the cabin, it cut through the air like a blade. Nate's smirk twitched, his fingers freezing mid-tap. Amira unzipped her bag with careful precision, her expression unreadable. The cabin wasn't just watching her now. They were holding their breath. She reached inside, pulling out a slim, black leather case, placing it on the tray table with quiet finality. The gold lettering gleamed under the cabin lights, but no one had the chance to read it before she flipped it open. Silence rippled outward, swift and suffocating. The laughter was gone. The smirks vanished. The expectation that she would stand up and slink away collapsed in an instant. Nate's Adam's apple bobbed. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Sabrina shifted, blinking rapidly as if her mind hadn't yet processed what she was seeing. The businessman lowered his watch, his posture suddenly too stiff, too forced. Amira let them sit in it. For the first time since stepping onto the plane, she spoke, not a whisper, not a plea, but a statement of absolute certainty. Special Agent Amira Holloway, she said, her voice steady, clear, cutting through the cabin like a blade through silk. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division. The flight attendant took a sharp step back. A choked sound came from somewhere in the row behind her, a strangled half-gasp, half-realization. Amira tapped her badge with a single finger. This entire interaction, she continued, has been recorded and transmitted to the DOJ in real time. She tilted her head slightly, watching as the weight of her words crushed the people around her. I'd ask if anyone here would like to clarify their behavior, but I think the evidence speaks for itself. Nate blinked once, twice, his mind visibly scrambling for a response. His voice cracked, the arrogance draining from his face so quickly it almost looked painful. He swallowed hard, forcing a laugh that came out shaky, brittle. This is a joke, right? Amira didn't blink. Sabrina inhaled sharply, her expression paling. Oh my God, she whispered, gripping Nate's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. The businessman cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Now hold on, he started, his previous annoyance replaced with forced calm. Let's not make this into something bigger than it needs to be. Amira's gaze snapped toward him. Bigger than it needs to be? She echoed. So, harassment, intimidation, and coordinated humiliation weren't big enough? The color drained from his face. The woman with the diamond bracelet had gone rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Amira didn't move, didn't adjust her posture, didn't even raise her voice. She didn't need to. I'd suggest, she said, that anyone who values their future stay silent from this point forward. The silence inside the cabin had thickened into something suffocating, the weight of Amira's badge still crushing down on every person who had dared to humiliate her. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even breathed too loudly. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that it left everyone scrambling to process what had just happened. Nate was the first to break. He leaned forward slightly, his smirk long gone, his posture tense. Look, I think, he started, but his voice wavered, cracking in a way that betrayed the panic crawling beneath his skin. Amira lifted a single hand, palm facing outward, cutting him off mid-sentence. Don't. The command was quiet, effortless, and absolute. A sharp chime rang through the cabin as the intercom clicked on. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking, a steady voice announced. Due to an unexpected security matter, we are making an unscheduled landing. We appreciate your cooperation. Nate stiffened, his knuckles widening against the armrest. Sabrina turned to him in horror, her perfectly curated composure unraveling. What did you do? She hissed under her breath, her nails digging into his sleeve. A rustling sound near the front of the cabin turned every head. A pair of broad-shouldered men in dark suits stepped inside, their expressions unreadable, their movements smooth and efficiently practiced. The kind of men who didn't show up unless something serious was about to go down. One of them, a tall man with an earpiece coiled behind his ear, scanned the passengers before his gaze locked onto Nate. His voice was calm, clipped, and entirely devoid of emotion. Nathaniel Coldwell? The blood drained from Nate's face. Sabrina's grip tightened. Wait, what's happening? She whispered, voice thin with desperation. The agent stepped forward, flashing a badge that outranked every single person in the room. Mr. Coldwell, you are under arrest for financial fraud, money laundering, and civil rights violations. You have the right to remain silent. A strangled sound left Nate's throat, somewhere between a gasp and a failed attempt to deny reality. This is a mistake, he stammered, his hands twitching against the tray table. You can't just, sir, do not resist, the second agent warned, his tone sharper now. I suggest you comply. Passengers gaped in stunned horror as Nate was pulled from his seat, his expensive watch glinting under the fluorescent lights, as his wrists were swiftly restrained in a set of cold, unforgiving handcuffs. The sound of the metal clicking into place rang louder than anything else in the suffocating silence. Sabrina shot to her feet, her perfectly manicured nails shaking as she grabbed the sleeve of one of the agents. Wait, you can't. He didn't. This is insane. Her voice was rising, frantic now, her mask of superiority shattering. The agent barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am, sit down." Her mouth opened, then closed, her breathing uneven. The businessman across the aisle, who had once looked at Amira with condescension, sat frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. The woman with the diamond bracelet clutched her handbag like it was a lifeline, her knuckles stark white. The lead flight attendant, who had so eagerly participated in the mockery, took a slow step backward as Amira shifted her attention toward him. His eyes darted toward the other crew members, searching for backup that wasn't coming. Amira didn't rush. She let the silence stretch, let the man feel the weight of his own actions. Then she spoke, her tone mild but razor sharp. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" The flight attendant's throat bobbed. I was just following." "Following what?" she interrupted, tilting her head slightly. "A culture of discrimination? A long-standing pattern of selective mistreatment?" The captain's voice returned over the intercom. "Cabin crew, please prepare for landing." The lead attendant looked like he wanted to disappear. Amira reached into her pocket, retrieving her phone with measured ease. "Consider this your formal notice," she said, barely glancing at the screen as she tapped out a message. "I've already contacted your corporate office. They'll be waiting for you when we land." The man visibly paled. A woman in the back of the cabin, who had stayed silent throughout the ordeal, quietly pulled out her phone and started recording. She wasn't the only one. The flight attendant stumbled back, his hands curling into fists before he forced them to relax. He turned, walking stiffly toward the galley, his breath uneven. Sabrina collapsed into her seat, her shoulders hunched in defeat as Nate sat rigid beside her, his face twisted in stunned disbelief. The plane touched down with a jolt, the landing gear roaring against the tarmac, but inside the cabin, no one moved. The energy had shifted beyond repair. Amira sat perfectly still, her face composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. She didn't need to look at Nate to know he was breaking apart from the inside, the weight of his own arrogance finally caving in on him. Sabrina had stopped speaking entirely, her fingers clenched into the fabric of her designer dress, her eyes fixed forward as if she could will herself out of existence. The flight attendant who had so confidently dismissed Amira mere hours ago now stood near the galley, his posture stiff, his face void of color. The moment the seatbelt sign dinged, passengers scrambled for their phones, some pretending to check messages, others openly recording as two uniformed officers boarded the plane. The agents from earlier stepped aside as the officers approached Nate, who barely had time to inhale before they seized his arms, pulling him from his seat in a practiced, merciless motion. The cuffs around his wrists rattled, metal biting into his skin as he was yanked to his feet. The once proud man who had stretched out in his first-class seat, who had laughed at Amira, who had orchestrated her humiliation with the ease of someone who had never known consequence, now stood exposed in the most public, humiliating way possible. Passengers whispered in hushed, shocked voices, their gazes flickering between their screens, and the real-life spectacle unfolding before them. A woman 2 rows ahead of Amira turned her phone slightly, ensuring she captured every detail. A younger man in business casually leaned toward his companion, muttering, "This is going viral in minutes." Nate finally broke. "Wait," he gasped, his voice hoarse, his forced bravado shattering like glass. You don't have to do this here." I'll cooperate, just." He glanced desperately around the cabin, but there was no help coming, no one left to back him up. He had played his game, but he had bet against the wrong person. The officer gripping his arm didn't hesitate. "Let's go." They dragged him forward, his body jolting slightly with each step, his expensive shoes scuffing against the floor. As he passed Amira, his eyes darted toward her, a flicker of something desperate, something pleading. She met his gaze for exactly 1 second before looking away. He wasn't worth her time. Sabrina jolted up from her seat, reaching out as if to stop them. "You can't do this. He's important." Her voice cracked, brittle and panicked, as if she could somehow rewind the events that had already spiraled beyond her control. One of the agents barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am, I suggest you stay seated." Nate was gone before she could respond. The cabin doors opened, the officers leading him down the jet bridge, his figure swallowed by the flashing lights of cameras waiting beyond. The news had spread before the plane had even landed. The second his feet touched the ground, he ceased to be Nathaniel Coldwell, powerful businessman. He became a disgraced criminal, a cautionary tale, a man whose face would be plastered across every screen for all the wrong reasons. Amira remained seated as the passengers began disembarking, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. The flight attendant who had placed the economy pamphlet on her tray earlier hesitated near the exit, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for his clipboard. He stopped himself, his throat bobbing, his gaze darting toward her before falling away. Whatever he had been about to say, it wouldn't change anything. The woman with the diamond bracelet walked past, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her lips pressed so tightly together they were nearly white. The businessman who had suggested she move seats kept his head down, his steps quick, as if eager to escape the reality of what had just unfolded. By the time Amira stepped off the plane, the terminal was already alive with murmurs, with whispers, with the echoes of justice playing out in real time. She walked through the crowd, her pace steady, her presence no longer questioned. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, messages from colleagues, a missed call from a reporter, a single text from her superior. "Nice work. See you at debriefing." She exhaled slowly, the weight of everything settling in, but there was no relief in her chest, only the quiet certainty that this had never been about her alone. This wasn't just about a first-class seat. This was about who people thought deserved to be there. And today, she had made damn sure they would never forget the answer. The end. If you loved watching justice unfold, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. What was the most satisfying moment for you? Did Nate deserve an even harsher punishment? Let me know in the comments below. And tell me, where are you watching from today?